We've all heard those stories, the kind where a loved one passes and the family instantly turns into a pack of wolves fighting over scraps. My story? It wasn't about scraps. It started with a small, manageable theft and ended with a revelation so massive it cracked my entire world open. My name is Eliza. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I lived in a modest rented apartment in the quieter suburbs of Boston, which suited my profession perfectly. I was a quiet bookbinder and conservator, running a small business restoring antique volumes. I preferred the smell of old paper to the flash of new money. My sister, Clara, was the supernova. She was 35, a high-powered, high-spending PR executive who thrived in the glittering chaos of Manhattan. We existed in two completely different solar systems. I was the grounded one. She was the demanding one, utterly convinced the world was her stage, and our father, bless his meticulous heart, was her primary investor. Our dad, a successful but intensely private real estate developer, was the quiet center of our chaos. Adored us both, but he saw us. He saw Clara's ambition, which often bordered on entitlement, and he saw my quiet resilience. When he passed away suddenly last autumn, a swift, cruel heart attack that stole his voice before he could finish his morning coffee, the silence he left behind was deafening, especially in his grand, echoing study. That silence was quickly filled by Clara's distinct, calculating energy. She mourned, yes, but her grief was overlaid with a kind of predatory focus. I just mourned. I missed his terrible jokes, the way he always smelled faintly of cedar and expensive pipe tobacco, and the long, rambling philosophical discussions we used to have late into the night. Relationship between Clara and me had always been a tightrope walk. As children, she was the princess who demanded my toys. As adults, she was the polished socialite who subtly implied my life choices were charmingly provincial. I didn't resent her success. I just wanted honest space. But inheritance, it turns out, dissolves all boundaries. Dad had been clear years ago that we would both be taken care of. Everything is sorted, girls, he'd promised, patting my hand during a late dinner. You'll both have what you need to be free. That promise was the only comfort I held on to in the miserable, confusing weeks after his funeral. Then came the meeting with Mr. Harrison, Dad's longtime, rather stiff attorney, a man whose face seemed permanently set in an expression of mild disapproval. The air in his office was thick and cold, smelling of leather and old money. Clara arrived late, of course, sweeping in with a pair of oversized designer sunglasses perched on her head, her phone buzzing incessantly. She didn't look at me, only at the leather folder Mr. Harrison placed on the mahogany table. I remember thinking, this is it. The moment we learn what Dad really thought of us. I expected a fair split, maybe a slightly larger portion for Clara given her history of high spending and Dad's habit of bailing her out, but something equitable. What I received was a punch to the gut that was merely the prelude to the true, brutal shock yet to come. The first lie was about to be read, and I was too numb from grief to question the script. The air crackled as Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. He droned through the preamble, the legal jargon that felt designed to obscure rather than reveal. Then came the numbers. The total estate value was mentioned, a figure I barely registered, something in the multi-millions, managed by trusts and accounts I'd never heard of. But the immediate disbursement, the liquid assets allocated directly to us, was the critical part. Mr. Harrison paused, adjusted his tie, and delivered the blow that felt far too small to be real. To Eliza, my youngest daughter, my love, and my appreciation for your sensible nature, I bequeath the sum of $500,000. $500,000. A beat of silence. My stomach dropped, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. $500,000 is not insignificant, yet given the scope of Dad's wealth, it felt like a polite dismissal. Then came Clara's allocation. Mr. Harrison continued, to Clara, my eldest, and to ensure the continuation of the family name and her established lifestyle, I bequeath the remainder of the liquid assets, totaling $3 million. Before Mr. Harrison could finish the sentence, Clara let out a theatrical gasp that morphed into a triumphant, if slightly watery, laugh. She didn't acknowledge me. She didn't look sad or grateful. She looked victorious. "Oh, Daddy," she cooed, snapping her fingers at Mr. Harrison's assistant for a glass of water she didn't drink. $500,000 for Eliza. That's lovely, isn't it? Enough for that little apartment she's always wanted, away from the city grime. Her words, framed as kindness, were barbed with condescension. My $500,000 suddenly felt less like an inheritance and more like a severance package, a payment to keep me quiet and on the periphery. In the days that followed, Clara's transformation from mourning daughter to exuberant heiress was sickeningly fast. The ink on the initial probate documents was barely dry before the floodgates opened. Our father had only been gone a month, yet Clara was already planning. Her long-standing engagement to an investment banker named Julian, a man whose personality was as dry as his portfolio, suddenly accelerated. The wedding, which had been indefinitely postponed due to Dad's death, was now fast-tracked and inflated to ludicrous proportions. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a societal declaration. The venue, a historic manor house overlooking the Pacific. The dress, a custom-designed six-figure monstrosity. Every detail screamed unlimited budget. The stark contrast framed the entire situation perfectly. I was quietly trying to manage my grief, looking at modest, practical ways to use my $500,000, maybe starting a small business, maybe finally buying a secure home. Clara, meanwhile, was using her apparent windfall to fund an absolute fantasy. I overheard a phone call where she casually mentioned the wedding budget had already crossed the $800,000 mark. That figure stuck in my mind, a toxic little seed of suspicion. If the total initial liquid asset distribution was $3.5 million, $3 million to her, $500,000 to me, how could her wedding alone swallow nearly $1 million, with no apparent concern for the future? It wasn't just the spending that bothered me, it was the speed. It suggested not just confidence, but certainty. A certainty that this initial payout was merely the appetizer. I remembered Dad's meticulous nature, his obsession with fairness, his complex trusts. The $500,000 felt like a test, and I was failing it by accepting it so meekly. The grief kept me silent, but the growing suspicion about Clara's sheer, unbridled entitlement started to give way to a focused, cold determination. My quiet suspicion was hardening into a need for truth, a quiet voice asking, what did he really mean for me to have? The weeks leading up to the wedding became a grueling public spectacle of excess. Clara rebranded the event as the Nuptials of the Century, a title she bestowed upon it herself during a live interview with a local society columnist. Every detail was an extravagant flourish, a deliberate statement that Dad's passing hadn't just secured her future, it had launched her into a new, glittering orbit. There were daily updates filtering through my few remaining social contacts. A $50,000 ice sculpture of a swan, a famous opera singer flown in from Milan for a 10-minute performance, and a fleet of vintage Rolls-Royces for the bridal party. It wasn't just tacky, it was financially reckless. That $800,000 budget I'd overheard quickly became a starting point, and I watched, horrified, as my $500,000 inheritance seemed to be swallowed whole by her escalating demands, if only figuratively. The principal of the thing gnawed at me. She was spending my security, the fraction of Dad's love he'd explicitly earmarked for me, and she didn't even care enough to be discreet. Meanwhile, my own life felt painfully small and restrictive. The $500,000, while substantial, was already earmarked. I was determined to use it exactly as Dad likely intended, as a foundation, not a slush fund. I paid off my student loans, a massive weight lifted, and put a down payment on a modest duplex outside the city, a quiet, sturdy place. The process left me with less than $100,000 for renovations and starting my small online book restoration business. I was scrimping, budgeting, and living a reality of careful choices, a jarring contrast to the financial oblivion Clara was embracing. The internal conflict was a constant hum. Should I just accept my portion and move on, or was I betraying Dad's memory by letting Clara steamroll the entire process? My financial strain, born out of prudence, felt like a punishment, while Clara's carelessness was being celebrated. The first concrete clue didn't come from a document. It came from a conversation. I was at the sprawling family estate, clearing out Dad's final things, a task Clara had deemed beneath her. Mr. Henderson, the estate's long-serving groundskeeper, was helping me box up old gardening tools. He was a man of few words, but immense loyalty. "She's happy, Miss Eliza," he said gruffly, nodding towards the road, referring to Clara's latest delivery of custom-imported champagne. "But it's a terrible waste. Your father always told me the real money, the family legacy, wasn't to be touched until the second reading. He said it was his insurance policy." "The second reading?" I repeated, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What are you talking about, Henderson? There was only one will read." Henderson stopped, looked around nervously, and lowered his voice. "The real one. The one with the international holdings. The one he said only Mr. Davies could authorize. He said Harrison was only ever for the interim funds, the pocket change. Said he didn't trust anyone but Mr. Davies with the real final papers. Mr. Harrison is a good man, but he was always just the local probate lawyer." The name hit me. Mr. Davies. I had never heard of him. A new lawyer, a second lawyer, for a second reading, and a mention of international holdings, the kind of wealth that dwarfed the initial $3.5 million distribution. The $500,000 wasn't just small, it was a distraction. Suddenly, the lavishness of Clara's wedding expenditure didn't make sense as something funded by the $3 million, it made sense as something she was funding through an unauthorized advance she believed was hers, an advance she had either manipulated or somehow stole from a separate, massive pool of funds I knew nothing about. The quiet suspicion now had a name, Davies, and a chilling concept, the true will. The mention of Mr. Davies and the second reading became an obsession. It was the contrast I needed, the flashy, careless theft of my $500,000 against the backdrop of a potential massive truth. The realization hit me with cold force. Dad didn't shortchange me. He was playing chess, and I'd only been looking at the pawns. I had to find Mr. Davies, but I couldn't trust Mr. Harrison, who seemed either complicit or conveniently oblivious. My search began where all serious detective work starts now, late nights on my cheap laptop swimming through the murky waters of online probate and trust laws. I wasn't looking for a loophole. I was looking for a common estate planning strategy Dad, with his layered business dealings, might have used. That's when I discovered the concept of a pour-over will and testamentary trusts, designed to handle complex international assets separately from the primary local probate. The rabbit hole led me to a quiet, unassuming law office above a dusty antique shop downtown. The sign simply read, L. Chen, Estate Law and Dispute Resolution. Liam Chen was everything Mr. Harrison was not. Young, slightly rumpled, and more interested in the logic of the law than the status of his clientele. He listened patiently as I recounted the tale of the meager $500,000, the lavish wedding, and the groundskeeper's cryptic comments about a second lawyer named Davies and insurance. "This initial distribution," Liam said, tapping the probate document I'd brought, "is a red flag for a man of your father's wealth. It's too clean, too simple. It almost looks like an interim distribution designed to cover immediate needs while the bulk of the assets, the complex, taxable ones, are managed outside of primary probate." He pointed to a small, almost invisible clause tucked away on the third page. "See here? The language around the executor's scope of authority. It explicitly limits Mr. Harrison's purview to assets held domestically and solely in your father's personal name. It also mentions a separate corporate succession document held in escrow." That was the seismic shift. Liam's calm, legal explanation made Henderson's vague warning concrete. "It doesn't say this is the entire will, Eliza. It says this is the will concerning these specific assets." A seasoned estate planner would use a setup like this to avoid delays and taxes on the bulk of a massive estate. The corporate succession document is likely the real final instrument that distributes the vast majority of the wealth, the one tied up in the international holdings Henderson mentioned. And it's not under Harrison's control. So, Clara's $3 million, I started, the realization dawning. That $3 million and your $500,000 likely came from easily accessible local bank accounts. Pocket change, just as your groundskeeper put it. The true, multi-million-dollar estate? It's still locked away, waiting for the authority of the true executor, the one named in the corporate succession document. If Clara has spent more than her initial $3 million on this wedding, she's either taken unauthorized loans against the main estate, which is illegal, or she's somehow accessed and manipulated that escrow account. The blood rushed out of my head. Clara hadn't just taken my $500,000. She had, at a minimum, fraudulently overspent her initial share, and at worst, committed a far larger crime, banking on the fact that I would be too grieving and too satisfied with my small inheritance to ever look for the true will and the true executor, Mr. Davies. The day of Clara's wedding arrived like a gilded hurricane. I attended, not as a celebration of family, but as an observer documenting the crime. My lawyer, Liam Chen, insisted I be there. "She needs to see you," he'd advised, "and you need to see the scale of the deceit she's built. It will solidify your resolve." The venue was the historic Bayside Manor, a sprawling estate dripping with old-world wealth. Every single detail screamed the $500,000 I had not spent, amplified 10 times over. The marquee alone looked like it cost more than my entire duplex. Waiters glided by with trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than my monthly grocery bill, their movement as smooth as the silk of Clara's enormous custom gown. I wore the most expensive dress I owned, a simple emerald sheath, and felt like a tiny, necessary shadow in her blinding light. The contrast was visceral. As I watched Clara take Julian's arm, her face alight with self-satisfaction, I didn't see a bride. I saw a thief basking in her ill-gotten gains. The entire spectacle was a monument built on the assumption that my grief and my quiet nature meant I would never look deeper than the initial probate documents. The entire structure of the day was a taunt. "Look what I bought with your inheritance, Eliza, and this is just the beginning." I positioned myself near the back, a strategic distance from the main family table. But I wasn't quiet enough. During the cocktail hour, as I was examining a truly hideous ice sculpture of a double swan, a detail I knew cost tens of thousands, Clara spotted me. She glided over, not out of sisterly affection, but pure proprietary arrogance. "Eliza," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It's lovely you came. Try the canapes. They're imported." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, this whole thing, the flowers, the private jet for the photographer, all of it, well, it ended up costing quite a bit more than we thought. But Daddy would have wanted me to have the best, wouldn't he? It's what the family deserves." The implication was clear. She viewed the entire estate, present and future, as her birthright, and my $500,000 as a charity handout. The brazen entitlement almost made me physically ill. I gripped my champagne flute, forcing a bland smile. "It's certainly a spectacle, Clara. I hope Julian appreciates the investment." Before the confrontation could escalate into the necessary, messy fight I knew was coming, my phone buzzed. It was Liam. A text. "Got him, checking property records. Davies is not a lawyer. He's the trustee of the foundation. Critical piece found in an old deed of trust attached to the Bayside Manor sale, a sale Dad handled 20 years ago. The executor is the foundation itself, administered by the trustee. Call me immediately, discreetly." The ground shifted beneath my feet. Mr. Davies wasn't just a lawyer. He was the fiduciary for a foundation. And Dad hadn't just owned Bayside Manor. He had been involved in its sale years ago, and left behind a trail of breadcrumbs in the property's paperwork. The very venue Clara had chosen for her monumental act of theft was the site of the key. I gave Clara a final hard look. No smile this time, just cold assessment. "Enjoy your big day, Clara. I have to go now. Something unexpected came up." Her smile faltered. For the first time all day, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. I had the name, I had the role, and I was about to find the real will. I left Bayside Manor without a word to anyone, the celebratory chaos fading behind me as I raced back to my quiet duplex and the waiting call from Liam. His discovery was the bomb I needed. The deed of trust, dating back 2 decades, was Dad's signature move, a carefully hidden document that bypassed local probate entirely and pointed straight to a major private family foundation, the true holder of the vast estate. Liam explained that Clara hadn't just overspent her $3 million. She had successfully manipulated Mr. Harrison, the local lawyer, into prematurely releasing funds from the foundation's investment account, likely by forging or misrepresenting Dad's signature on a temporary release form, claiming it was for immediate tax liabilities. The amount she had accessed and subsequently funneled into her wedding and various prenuptial investments wasn't $500,000. It was closer to $3.5 million on top of the initial distribution. Liam, following the paper trail, found the smoking gun, a digitally altered transfer request. Dad's signature had been meticulously copied from an old insurance policy document, and the date was post-mortem. It wasn't just theft of my hypothetical share. It was straight-up financial fraud and forgery against the foundation, a legal entity designed to protect the very wealth she was trying to plunder. The evidence was irrefutable, digital breadcrumbs leading directly to Clara's personal business accounts. The sheer audacity, using our father's death and the ensuing chaos to commit a massive calculated crime, was staggering. The decision to file suit was the hardest choice of my life. Liam laid out the facts. If I didn't step forward now, Clara would continue to raid the foundation's assets, believing she had successfully buried the truth. The $20 million estate, the family legacy, the reason Dad worked so hard, would be systematically drained. But filing the suit meant destroying my relationship with my only sister, dragging the family name through a very public, very ugly scandal, and accepting the fact that the person I had shared a childhood with was a cold, calculating criminal. The emotional weight was crushing. I sat in my quiet kitchen, looking at the mortgage papers for the small home I'd bought with my modest $500,000, and I cried. Not for the lost money, but for the lost sister. "This isn't about revenge, Eliza," Liam said gently during one of our late-night calls. "It's about justice, and more importantly, it's about honoring your father's intent. He set up this complex structure for a reason, to protect the wealth from exactly this type of predatory behavior. You are the only one who can step into that role now." His words solidified my resolve. I wasn't just suing Clara, I was protecting Dad's legacy. I authorized Liam to file a massive civil suit, citing fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty against Clara, and demanding an immediate forensic audit of the foundation's accounts. The papers were filed the day after Clara returned from her 2-day honeymoon, a swift, brutal strike designed to freeze her access and force the truth out. The shockwave would be immediate, and the path ahead would be painful, but I was finally on the right side of the fight. I was no longer the quiet sister who accepted her small portion. I was the legitimate heir fighting for the truth of the true will. The fallout was immediate, explosive, and exactly what Liam had predicted. Clara's initial reaction wasn't shock or remorse, it was white-hot fury, directed entirely at me. I was served with her countersuit a week later, a document thicker than a phone book, alleging harassment, defamation, and malicious interference with estate proceedings. She framed my search for the true will as a greedy, jealous attempt to undermine her legitimate claim, painting herself as the grieving, responsible heir and me as the resentful sister who couldn't handle her life choices. Her lawyers, expensive and aggressive, tried every dirty trick to intimidate me, including threatening to expose my modest business's private finances and alleging I had mental instability. My resolve had to become steel. To fund the looming legal battle, I had to make a sacrifice that tore at me. The down payment I'd made on the duplex, the secure home Dad's $500,000 was supposed to provide, had to be liquidated. I pulled the money out, canceling the purchase, and moved back into my tiny, cramped rental apartment. This was the true cost of fighting her. I had given up the only tangible security I had. The contrast was painful. Clara was fighting for access to tens of millions to maintain a lavish lifestyle she hadn't earned, while I was fighting to honor Dad's memory by sacrificing the only financial stability he had given me. But with that sacrifice came an unwavering resolve. I wasn't fighting for money anymore. I was fighting for the truth of my father's careful, deliberate plan, and for the integrity of his memory. One evening, staring at the small framed photo of my father on my temporary desk, I was hit by a clear, specific memory. A moment that suddenly made the $20 million estate figure, which Liam was starting to confirm, terrifyingly real. It was a cold December night, about 5 years ago. I was complaining about my entry-level job's meager salary, venting my frustrations to Dad while he stirred a cup of tea in his study. The room was dark except for the light spilling from his antique safe, which was slightly ajar. I glanced over and saw a thick stack of bond certificates. gold leaf shining under the light. "You know, Eliza," he'd said without looking up, "most people think wealth is measured in bank accounts. They think in hundreds of thousands, maybe a couple million. They don't understand that real security, the kind that lasts generations, isn't liquid. It's held in things they can't easily see or touch." He closed the safe door with a heavy thunk and turned to me, his eyes serious. "I've built something that will protect you both. But only one of you understands the difference between a quick splash of cash and a solid foundation. The foundation, my dear, it's worth more than the whole street outside. Think about $20 million, that's a very specific number. It's the number you need to be free." He had smiled then, a cryptic, knowing smile. "But you have to prove you deserve the freedom it brings by not being distracted by the shiny things." The memory was the final piece of the puzzle. Dad had deliberately structured the two-tiered distribution. The small $3.5 million interim distribution and the massive locked $20 million foundation as a test. Clara was blinded by the initial shiny cash and was willing to steal to fund her vanity, proving her unworthiness. I, by giving up my security to fight for the principle of his plan, was proving I understood the value of the solid foundation. The courtroom showdown was approaching, and I was ready to read the true will for the world, and Clara, to hear. The courtroom on the day of the hearing was packed, a true spectacle of high drama and higher finance. Clara was there, pristine and defiant, flanked by her two aggressive lawyers who radiated arrogance. I sat next to Liam Chen, who, despite his quiet demeanor, now held the power to shatter her world. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for sharp legal precision, called the session to order. Clara's lawyers led with their countersuit, painting a picture of me as the grasping, jealous sibling trying to overturn a legitimate, settled probate. It was all noise and bluster, designed to obscure the simple central truth. Then Liam stood up. He didn't bother with theatrics. His voice was calm, clear, and utterly devastating. "Your Honor, my client is not here to dispute the initial local disbursement. She acknowledges the $500,000. We are here to introduce the true instrument of final distribution, the document that was legally sequestered from local probate and which reveals the complete estate, totaling over $20 million. He presented the evidence, a certified copy of the corporate succession document, witnessed and sealed by the aforementioned trustee, Mr. Davies, in an offshore jurisdiction. This was the true will. The courtroom atmosphere shifted instantly. Clara's face, which had been set in a mask of contemptuous amusement, went pale. Her lead lawyer, sweating profusely, immediately objected, calling the document a concocted forgery. The judge, however, reviewed the documents Liam had cross-referenced with the initial deed of trust and the foundation's corporate filings. She silenced the objection with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Mr. Chen has established a clear evidentiary link. Proceed." Liam then presented the forensic audit. He laid out the damning chain of evidence, the forged signature, the unauthorized transfer requests, and the direct, undeniable funneling of the foundation's principal funds, the very funds that made up the bulk of the $20 million estate, into Clara's personal accounts, and specifically to the vendors who executed her lavish wedding. "My sister didn't just take my $500,000, Your Honor," I heard myself whisper, my voice shaking with cold finality. "She stole from the foundation, a multi-million-dollar asset, and used those funds to pay for an $800,000 wedding. She treated my inheritance and my father's legacy as her personal slush fund, believing the small initial probate would blind me to the actual truth." Liam's final presentation focused on the conditions of the true will. The foundation's charter stipulated that the $20 million estate was to be divided between the two sisters, but only after a mandatory review period, and only if neither party had committed any act of financial fraud against the estate, the foundation, or each other during the initial probate. This was Dad's insurance policy. As the judge read the critical clause, Clara finally broke. "No, it's not real. Daddy would never do this. He meant for me to have it. Eliza, you lying little leech, you engineered this." She lunged slightly across the table, her facade of polished control completely dissolving into ugly tears and desperate denial. The bailiff had to restrain her. In that moment, watching her spectacular, self-inflicted collapse, I saw not the wealthy, beautiful sister, but the greedy child who still believed the biggest, shiniest toy should automatically be hers. The true will had been read, and it exposed her completely. The revelation of the $20 million estate details unfolded in the courtroom's heavy silence, punctuated only by Clara's ragged sobs. The judge, maintaining her stern composure, demanded the reading of the operative clause of the true will, the Foundation's mandate. Liam Chen stepped forward, his voice a steady counterpoint to the surrounding chaos. The document stipulated that the Foundation, holding assets primarily in international real estate and high-yield, diversified bonds, the true $20 million legacy, was to be immediately transferred to the sole remaining beneficiary unaffected by the initial fraud or malfeasance. The judge looked directly at Clara, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Clara," she stated, her voice cutting through the tension, "due to the irrefutable evidence of fraud, forgery, and the unauthorized depletion of Foundation principal for personal gain, you are hereby deemed to have forfeited any and all claim to the $20 million estate held within the Foundation. Furthermore, you will be required to return the $3.5 million you fraudulently accessed, pay punitive damages, and your initial $3 million disbursement will be sequestered to cover outstanding liabilities and legal costs," Clara screamed, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated loss, the sound of her entire life built on entitlement crumbling around her. Then, the judge turned to me. "Ms. Eliza, your father's will was, in effect, a two-tiered test. The initial small disbursement was the bait. He structured the Foundation to reward the child who demonstrated prudence, integrity, and the strength of character to protect the family legacy when it was challenged, not the child who rushed to spend the initial liquid cash." She paused, emphasizing every word. "By sacrificing your own immediate security to investigate the truth and prevent the continued erosion of the estate, you passed your father's test. You are the sole beneficiary of the $20 million Foundation estate." I felt a profound, sickening surge of shock and dizzying relief. $20 million. A number so large it felt fictional, a direct contrast to the $500,000 I'd been ready to fight for. It wasn't about the money, it was about the vindication. It was Dad telling me from beyond the grave that he saw me, he trusted me, and he had protected me from the sister who would have bankrupted both of us. The relief was overwhelming, washing away the months of gnawing suspicion, legal fear, and personal sacrifice. Clara was let out, still shrieking my name, calling me a traitor and a liar. Her consequences weren't just financial. The fraud investigation was immediately handed over to the district attorney for criminal review. Her lavish wedding, the monument built on her theft, was now the physical evidence of her crime. The irony was a cruel, perfect justice. I looked at Liam, who simply nodded. The quiet bookbinder who had settled for a small stipend was now the unexpected steward of a massive fortune, all because she had chosen truth over convenience and integrity over instant gratification. The sheer magnitude of the estate hit me then, a wave of responsibility that was terrifying, but also exhilarating. The game was over, and the patient, careful player had won everything. The aftermath wasn't a sudden burst of celebratory spending. It was a quiet, almost overwhelming process of triage and transition. The $20 million wasn't just a number. It represented international assets, complex trusts, and a vast responsibility. The first thing I did was rehire Liam Chen, not just as my lawyer, but as the primary executor and advisor for the newly transferred foundation. We spent weeks untangling the complicated knots my father had tied, restructuring the portfolio to align with his original, stated goal, using the wealth for sustainable philanthropy alongside securing my future. My quiet life didn't vanish, but it expanded. The small duplex I had to forego, I bought it back, securing that foundation I had fought for. My book restoration business grew from a small online venture to a funded, non-profit organization dedicated to preserving historical texts, a cause I knew Dad, the lover of quiet wisdom, would have wholeheartedly endorsed. The $20 million didn't make me flashy. It made me powerfully deliberate. Clara's fate was swift and brutal. The civil court ruling was damning, triggering an immediate and full criminal investigation. Her lavish wedding, once the symbol of her success, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. A $800,000 exhibit of fraud and misappropriation. Julian, her new husband, filed for an emergency annulment, citing her criminal exposure and the collapse of her inheritance. She lost the initial $3 million disbursement, which was mostly used to pay back the illegally accessed foundation funds and cover massive legal fees. She was left with nothing but crippling debt, legal woes, and the complete annihilation of her social standing. Her prison sentence was eventually suspended in favor of probation and mandatory restitution. But the true punishment was the public, humiliating loss of everything she thought defined her. The woman who stole $500,000 for her vanity had lost $23.5 million for her greed. My final reflection, sitting in Dad's old cedar-scented study, now mine, not in a physical sense but in a rightful one, was not on the money, but on the nature of family and true inheritance. My sister had taught me that entitlement is a form of blindness. It makes people believe they can take shortcuts to wealth and happiness. Dad had taught me that true wealth isn't what you possess, but what you are willing to sacrifice to protect what is right. The $500,000 was the cost of the lesson. The $20 million was the reward for passing the test. I hadn't lost a sister in that courtroom. I had simply acknowledged the sister I had lost years ago to her own corrosive ambition. The inheritance wasn't a gift, it was a mandate. It was my father's final, powerful message, that true legacy is not inherited through bloodline, but through character. I had fought for the integrity of his plan, and in doing so, I had secured a future of quiet purpose and profound freedom.